Hey guys, Redneck Mini 14 here. The other day I put up a video on the value of used handguns, and the purpose of that video was to just talk about the fact that I typically think of used guns, primarily handguns, to be a very good value. And a lot of people, for whatever reason, when talking about guns for new gun owners or gun owners on a budget, they typically skim over the whole used gun aspect, and they don't generally talk about it. They only talk about guns that are on the market today. And I just don't really understand why that is. Now, in that video, I did talk about a few things that you might want to look for when buying a used gun, and a few things that I've come across, because when you buy a used gun, sometimes you run the risk of buying somebody else's problems, or somebody screwed up a gun, like with a trigger job or something, and they don't want to mess with it anymore, and they sell it, and then you're stuck with somebody's botched trigger job, or something of that effect. So in this video, I'm just going to go over a little bit more in depth things that you might come across when buying a used gun. We're talking about handguns in this video, obviously. But just a few things that you might want to look for, especially if you're buying a used gun in store, in person. Now, some of these things, when buying online, you can ask for pictures and ask the seller questions. Of course, some things you can't really tell with just pictures. You have to physically have the gun in your hand and feel it for yourself to know if it's there or not. And some things, you can just ask questions for, and of course, sometimes the seller might lie to you, but you kind of run that risk when you buy things online, as far as used go. But in person, we're going to talk about a few things that you might want to look for. Now, first and foremost, one thing that you'll probably come across when buying a used handgun, if it has night sights, is the night sights probably are going to be dim. Now, this is a Car K9. All these guns are unloaded, by the way. And it has night sights, and they do glow a little bit. Now, I'd have to turn the light off, but I can tell you that they do glow, but they are pretty dim. And they're not entirely useless, but they are pretty dim, and you can probably get away with using them at night for now, but night sights, I think they say typically are good for about 10 years, and then they're past the point where they're actually useful, and so you just need to replace them. So if you get a gun with night sights, chances are you're probably going to need to replace the night sights eventually, and that goes for if you buy it new. Eventually you're going to have to replace the night sights if you want to use them as night sights. Now, they're of course still good for daytime sights. That's not a problem, but if you're looking for a gun with night sights, typically if you buy a used gun, they're probably going to be quite a bit dimmer than if you bought it new. So, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about some things that you might want to look for when buying a semi-automatic pistol. Now, I've bought quite a few semi-automatic pistols used. In fact, almost all the pistols that I own, I bought used. And I've only ever really had one pistol give me any problems, and that was this Ruger P94 in 40 cal, also known as a P944. The problem I had with this was I couldn't disassemble it. Now, I sent it off to Ruger, and they fixed the problem, so now it can be disassembled the right way. The way they disassemble is you lock the slide back, drop the mag, take your ejector, and you push it down, and then you release it, and then you pull, you line these two lines up here, you push your slide release out, and then you pull the slide off the gun. Could not do this with this pistol, and I had to send it off to Ruger, and I don't really know what happened, like maybe the barrel link or whatever, the drop link. Something was probably messed up with that, but they got it together and now it works just fine. So basically just some things you would want to look for when buying a gun in the shop is you'd want to take it apart, especially if it's something that's pretty easy to take apart like this gun, and just kind of look at the actual like places where it locks up, see how much wear is in there. If it has a drop link, see if it's a good drop link, and you can obviously check things like the rails and stuff like that and the spring. Some things you really can't tell unless you actually shoot the gun, like as far as the spring goes, because sometimes like a weak recoil spring can cause malfunctions, but you don't necessarily know that until you get the gun out and shoot it. So with a semi-automatic, there's only so many things you can actually tell without shooting it. But you can take a look at quite a few things, see how much wear there is, and whether or not you think it would actually be a good pistol. Now, like I said, I bought quite a few semi-automatics online used, and that's the only gun I had a problem with, and it was an easy fix. Sent it to Ruger, had to pay $30 for shipping, and they fixed it for free. And they sent a couple of free things along with it. So that's basically semi-automatics. Again, I'm not the end-all be-all expert. I know there's tons of other things you can look for if you're like really serious when it comes to buying guns, but typically when it comes to semi-automatics, I'm not that nervous about buying one. Typically, if you buy one, especially if it's a good model, it's typically going to be a pretty good buy. Now, some things I have learned with revolvers. Let's talk about the most basic one, and that is if you buy a revolver with a pinned front sight like this one. Actually, I think both of these are pinned front sights. Oh, come on, focus. Alright. If you buy a revolver with a pinned front sight, you might want to take a look at it and make sure that it does not wiggle. This one does have a little wiggle. It has play side to side, front to back, and it can actually come up and down just a little bit. It's hard to show on camera because my fingers actually take up most of the area. But I can assure you that this sight is very loose, like somebody probably dropped it on the sight, you know, like barrel down or something. It's still attached. I mean, I can't like just pull it off with my fingers. So it's not like a huge deal, but it is definitely broken, probably somewhere inside there, like the actual pinhole is probably cracked or like it just kind of shifted over time and wallered out the hole. So that's one thing you might want to look at. Never really considered that until I got a gun that had that problem. Another thing you need to consider when buying a revolver, and this is the thing that you have to actually have the revolver in your hand and feel it, is the timing. Now, I haven't had a problem with getting a revolver out of time, but what you want to do is you want to take your fingers, you put them on both sides here, and you want to do this with both double and single action. So you basically just want to apply a little bit of pressure as you're cocking the hammer, and then when it locks itself into place, you want to check and see if it's locked up, and it is, and pull the trigger, and it is, and you want to do the same thing with double action. So you want to apply a little bit of pressure and just make sure that it's actually locked up. Sometimes on an older revolver, if it's been shot a lot, if you do this little test to test the timing on it, sometimes after the trigger is pulled and the hammer drops, it's not all the way locked in place and the cylinder is free and it can spin freely. You don't want that to happen. And of course you want to check all 6 chambers, or however many chambers your revolver has. You want to make sure that all the chambers lock up good when doing double and single action. So that is one thing you definitely want to check. Have not had that problem with any of the used revolvers that I've bought. Another thing you want to check with revolvers, and I think this is mostly with Smith & Wessons. I guess people do it with Rugers too, but Ruger's a little bit different design, is the trigger job. So this is a Smith & Wesson Model 10, and it shoots double action pretty well. But you cock the hammer, put it in single action, and you touch that trigger, it'll jump forward. And this is because somebody at some point in time tried to lighten up this trigger, and they did their own homemade trigger job, and it's too light. So you can't put the right amount of pressure on it to actually keep the trigger back before the trigger actually jumps forward, unless you jerk it really fast, which is not ideal because that takes that puts a lot more human error into your single action shooting, and you don't want to do that. That just kind of defeats the purpose of actually shooting the gun single action. It doesn't make it as reliable, or as accurate rather. And it's not unsafe to do that on this gun just because it has the rebounding hammer. So as soon as it jumps forward, the hammer is blocked by the internal safety mechanism. So, it's not a dangerous gun to shoot, but you can't really shoot it accurately single action, or it just makes it harder to shoot this gun single action if you can't be accurate with it. So it's just a real pain. So that's definitely one thing you want to take a look at when buying a used revolver. And I think typically people do this with Smith & Wessons. I'm sure they do it with Rugers too, but I haven't heard of too many Rugers having that problem. Of course, there's probably a whole lot more Smith & Wessons out there to begin with, so that's probably another factor. But basically, those are just kind of the things that I've learned over time after buying so many used guns. Obviously, night sights, they're probably going to be dim or not, or they're not going to glow at all, depending on how old the gun is and how old the sights are. You definitely want to be able to take the pistol apart and check it for wear on all of the contact points. And if the gun doesn't come apart, that's an issue, and you should look into why it won't come apart and maybe send it to the manufacturer if the manufacturer is still around, or taking old guns and repairing them. So that's definitely one thing you want to take a look at. If the gun shop doesn't let you take the gun apart in the shop, basically talking about pistols here, something that's easy to take apart and put back together. If they don't let you do that, I wouldn't even bother buying it because they might be trying to hide something. You want to check your pinned front sights on your revolvers, and I guess, semi-automatics, some of them I guess have pinned front sights, like this one has a pinned front sight, but a lot of revolvers have pinned front sights, so you definitely want to check that if somebody dropped it and broke it. Same thing with the rear sights. If somebody dropped it on the sights, they might be loose, so you want to check that as well. You want to check your timing on your cylinder, make sure it actually locks up on every single chamber on double and single action, or if it's just a single action, obviously just single action. But you want to make sure it locks up good on every single chamber, every single pull of the trigger. And botched trigger jobs, you want to stay away from them because obviously I don't have a whole lot of experience with Smith & Wesson revolvers. I'm not comfortable trying to fix it myself because I think a lot of the older Smith & Wessons require a lot of hand fitting on their parts, so probably just gonna take that to a gunsmith, and that's probably gonna cost me $200 or so, which is why I haven't done anything with it yet, because I don't necessarily want to just drop $200, $250 on this revolver all at one time. So I still have that issue, but it is good for shooting double action, and all of these guns would still make good shooters. So that's all for this video. That's all the things that I personally have come across that you definitely want to check out if you're buying a used gun, especially in store. I'm sure there's tons of other things you want to look for, but those are just the ones that I've come across in my gun purchasing. So subscribe to my channel, like me on Facebook. I'm Redneck Mini 14, and until next time, be safe.